Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business News Afternoon Report for Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2024. I'm Sean Aylmer. Every afternoon, we've got the 5 stories that happened today that you need to know about. Story number 1, the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.2% today to 7,817 points. It fell on the opening, then scrambled higher for most of the day. Then it dropped, and then it spiked. Crazy day, really. The utilities and materials sectors were the worst on the day, while telcos were the best. Iron ore futures were lower, pulling down the big miners. BHP, Fortescue Metals Group and Rio Tinto all fell more than 1%. Telstra's share price continued its run of yesterday, jumping another 2.4%. In fact, it hit a 10-month high today. The banks were mixed, while the big retailers were generally higher. Insignia Financial's share price fell 7% after it told investors that it hadn't asked for M&A help from investment group Citi, as had been written in the media. And Bell Financial's share price jumped after it said it expects its first half profit pre-tax to rise by nearly 50%. Story number 2, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell appeared before Congress overnight, and the general takeout is that while the Fed doesn't quite have the information it needs to cut interest rates, it's looking very hard to find it. The quote that everyone seems to have focused on is, "Elevated inflation is not the only risk we face. Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment." End quote. That helped equity markets, with the S&P 500 again closing at a new high. That's 6 days of record highs in a row. The tech-heavy Nasdaq also closed at a new record. The tech stocks rallied, with Tesla up nearly 4% and Nvidia adding 2.5%. Apple jumped only 0.4%. But that was enough to push it past the US $3.5 trillion mark in value. Story number 3, Incitec Pivot says it ceased negotiations with Indonesia's PT Pupuk Kalimantan Timur for the sale of its fertilisers business. The splitting of the fertiliser and explosives business has been mooted for months, maybe years really, but today the company said the deal it was working on had fallen through, and going forward the explosives arm, Dyno Nobel, and the fertilisers division will be managed separately. That means no shared costs. CEO Mauro Neves said the strategy hasn't changed, but the company would have to work harder to execute it. It seems that the pace of negotiations around the sale were too slow for Incitec Pivot's liking, and there was a risk it wouldn't receive Foreign Investment Review Board approval anyhow. The company will also start its already announced $900 million stock buyback. Story number 4, South Australia has become the first state to sign a federal government agreement to ensure every household in Adelaide can be powered by renewable energy by 2030. The Renewable Energy Transformation Agreement is part of the federal government's plan to have an additional 32 gigawatts of renewable generation and storage built and operating by the end of the decade. Canberra will underwrite developers to build a minimum of 1,000 megawatts of new wind and solar projects and 400 megawatts of new storage capacity, bringing South Australia's total storage capacity to 600 megawatts. The state will establish its own grid reliability mechanism to be used in place of the national framework. And finally, story number 5, a couple of other state stories. In New South Wales, the government has banned retailing on Anzac Day. At the moment, retailing from 1 p.m. is allowed, but under new legislation, large retailers won't be able to open their doors at all. Western Australia is the only other state that closes retailers all day on April 15. And today, residents in Melbourne's west were told to stay indoors and motorists were told to drive with their windows up due to toxic smoke blowing through suburbs. That's because of a large factory fire. An apparent chemical explosion triggered the fire, and about 180 firefighters were at the scene for most of the day. Fire crews found multiple 44-gallon drums full of fuel at the site. Fortunately, there were no reports of injuries. That's it for the afternoon report for Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2024. Michael Thompson and I will be back tomorrow morning with a Thursday edition of Fear and Greed Business News. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your evening.